The day my grandmother's estate was divided, everyone in that room already knew how it was going to go. My cousin would get the farm, I would get whatever was left over. That was simply how things worked in our family, and nobody questioned it, least of all me. But then my cousin said something that made the entire room go quiet. And 3 seconds later, the attorney said something that made my cousin wish he never opened his mouth. My grandmother, Loretta May Pulliam, built everything she had with her own hands. She grew up poor in rural Kentucky, married young, and moved to central Tennessee with my grandfather in the 1970s. Together, they bought a modest piece of land outside of a small town called Carthage. My grandfather passed when I was 9, and after that, my grandmother ran everything herself. She leased portions of the farmland to neighboring operations, kept a small vegetable garden she was fiercely proud of, and lived in the main farmhouse until the very end. The property had been in the family for decades. Most people considered it unremarkable. Old fencing, a sagging barn, a gravel driveway that flooded every spring. But my grandmother called it hers, and that meant something. My cousin Archer had spent the past 8 years trying to modernize the operation. He pushed my grandmother to sell parcels, upgrade equipment, expand into commercial leasing. She resisted most of his suggestions, which irritated him constantly. Still, he showed up at family holidays, made a point of sitting beside her at church when he visited, and made sure everyone noticed when he helped fix the tractor or replaced a section of fence. He was good at being visible. He had always been good at that. I was not. I moved back to Tennessee 6 years ago, not because anyone asked me to, but because my grandmother needed help, and I was the only one who noticed. She had been diagnosed with early-stage congestive heart failure. The doctors were managing it, but the disease progressed the way those things do. Slowly at first, then all at once. She needed someone nearby. Someone who could drive her to appointments in Nashville, refill prescriptions, handle the insurance calls that left her frustrated and exhausted. Someone who could sit with her on the porch in the evenings when the loneliness became too heavy to carry alone. I was 31 when I moved back. I had been teaching elementary school in Knoxville, renting a small apartment, building something that felt like a real life. I gave up that apartment. I transferred my teaching position to a school 30 minutes from her property. I moved into the small guest room off the kitchen and told myself it was temporary. It wasn't temporary. For 6 years, I scheduled my life around her needs. I learned which pharmacist she preferred. I kept a color-coded calendar of her appointments. I sat in waiting rooms reading paperback novels while doctors reviewed her echocardiograms. I cooked dinner every night she didn't feel up to cooking herself, which eventually became every night. I learned how to monitor her fluid intake. Because her cardiologist said retention was the biggest risk, I learned what signs to watch for. I called the on-call nurse at 2 in the morning twice in one winter because something felt wrong, and I trusted my instincts more than I trusted sleep. My grandmother and I talked every single evening. We sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and she told me stories I had never heard. About her own mother, about what Tennessee looked like when she was a girl, about the early years of her marriage, when they had almost nothing, and it somehow felt like enough. I learned more about her in those 6 years than I had in my entire childhood. She became, in a way I hadn't expected, one of my closest friends. Archer visited during that time. Holidays, mostly. Sometimes a long weekend in the summer. He always had opinions about the property. What should be sold, what should be developed, what my grandmother was too sentimental about. He talked about her land like it was an asset that hadn't been properly optimized. My grandmother listened politely, and then, once he left, would shake her head slowly and go back to her crossword puzzle. She never said anything unkind about him directly. That wasn't her way. But I understood what the head shake meant. Nobody in the extended family seemed to register what my daily life looked like. When relatives called, they asked about Archer. How was his work going? Had he finally convinced Grandma Loretta to update the barn? They mentioned me occasionally. The way you mention a piece of furniture. Yes, She's still there. She's helpful. That's good. I stopped expecting acknowledgement somewhere around year 3. I didn't do any of it for acknowledgement. I did it because she needed me and I loved her, and some things are simply that uncomplicated. My grandmother passed in March, 2 weeks after her 84th birthday. She died at home, in her own bed, with the window open the way she always wanted it. I was there. I held her hand. I had been awake most of the night before because her breathing had changed, and I could feel in my bones that we were close to the end. After she was gone, I sat in the kitchen for a long time before I called anyone. I needed a few minutes that belonged only to us. The funeral brought relatives I hadn't seen in years. People flew in from Georgia, from Ohio, from 2 different parts of Texas. Everyone had stories about Loretta. Everyone cried in that specific public way that funerals produce. Archer gave a short speech that mentioned his own role in her later years, with a warmth that I found difficult to listen to. He talked about fixing things on the property. He talked about her pride in the family name. He said she would have wanted the land to continue in capable hands. Several older relatives nodded. I stood in the back row and looked at my shoes. A week later, we gathered at the offices of an estate attorney in Nashville. The room was wood paneling and leather chairs and the particular silence of places where money changes hands. My aunt arrived with her 2 daughters. Several cousins I barely knew sat along the wall. Archer wore a jacket I had never seen before. Structured, expensive, the kind of thing you wear when you want to look like someone who belongs in rooms like this. The attorney, Mr. Caldwell, was a methodical man in his 60s. He set a stack of documents on the table and reviewed them without rushing. "Your grandmother's estate has been carefully arranged over a number of years," he said. "She worked closely with this office to ensure her intentions were documented precisely." My aunt nodded as if this confirmed something she already knew. Mr. Caldwell reached the primary distribution first. The farmland, outbuildings, and primary agricultural operations of the Pulliam property, totaling approximately 340 acres, shall pass in full to Archer James Pulliam. Archer exhaled slowly. He didn't smile outright, but his posture changed. He leaned back just slightly, the way people do when they have been proven right about something. The attorney continued. "The farmhouse household contents and the surrounding residential parcel of approximately 4 acres shall pass to Cecilia Pulliam." That was me. A murmur ran through the room. My aunt glanced at me with something between pity and polite discomfort. A cousin I didn't know well looked away. Archer turned in his chair and looked at me directly. He actually smiled. "4 acres," he said. Not loudly. Just loud enough. "That's generous." A few people shifted in their seats. Nobody laughed, but nobody told him to stop either. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, like he was doing math. 6 years, he said. 6 years living there and you ended up with the house. He shook his head like he found the whole thing mildly amusing. Then he said the thing that made the room go completely still. I guess Grandma figured out pretty quickly that showing up isn't the same as being useful." I felt it land in my chest before I fully processed the words. Showing up. As if 6 years of driving her to cardiology appointments and tracking her fluid retention and learning how to read an echocardiogram report and sitting beside her at 2 in the morning when she couldn't breathe right. As if all of that was just showing up. As if presence were the lesser thing, the passive thing, the thing that anyone could do. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat had closed in a way that had nothing to do with crying and everything to do with rage. Before anyone else could speak, Mr. Caldwell set down the folder he was holding. He folded his hands on the table. "Actually," he said, in the same calm, unhurried tone he had used for everything else, "there is one additional matter your grandmother asked me to address." She was specific about the order in which things should be presented. The shift in the room was immediate. Archer's expression didn't change, but he sat forward. Mr. Caldwell reached into a separate section of his briefcase and removed a manila envelope, sealed and worn at the edges, the kind of thing that had been sitting somewhere important for a long time. Beside it, he placed a separate legal folder, thicker than the first. Your grandmother left a letter, he said. She asked that it be read aloud before the second document is reviewed. I had not known about a letter. Nobody had mentioned a letter. Mr. Caldwell opened the envelope carefully. The handwriting inside was my grandmother's. Careful and looped, the way people wrote before everything became a keyboard. I recognized it immediately. She had written me birthday cards in that handwriting every single year of my life. He cleared his throat. Dear family, he began. I have asked Mr. Caldwell to read this after the primary distribution is announced, because I know how human nature works. I know that people hear numbers and stop listening. I want everyone in that room to still be listening when I say what I need to say. Nobody moved. I built this property over 50 years with your grandfather. After he passed, I ran it alone. I made every decision. I knew every acre. I also knew, in my final years, exactly what I needed. And I knew who provided it. Archer was very still now. Archer has worked hard. He understands the business side of land management better than I ever did. The agricultural operation belongs with him. That was never a question. My cousin nodded, almost imperceptibly. But there is a difference between someone who understands the value of land and someone who understands the value of a person. The room held its breath. For 6 years, my granddaughter Cecilia rearranged her entire life without being asked. She did not negotiate. She did not keep a ledger of what she gave up. She learned things about my health that I did not know myself, because she paid closer attention than my own doctors did on some days. She sat with me in the dark when I was afraid, and she never once made me feel like a burden. My vision blurred. I pressed my fingers flat against the table to keep myself anchored. I gave her the house because she made it a home, but that is not the whole of what I am leaving her. Mr. Caldwell set the letter down and reached for the second folder. 6 years ago, he said, returning to his professional register, your grandmother entered into a preliminary agreement with a land development consultancy regarding the mineral and subsurface rights attached to the residential parcel. Archer frowned. The 4-acre parcel? The 4-acre parcel, Caldwell confirmed, sits at the northern boundary of the larger property. Geological surveys conducted in 2019 identified significant natural gas deposits beneath the residential parcel and a portion of the adjacent land. Silence. Complete silence. Your grandmother retained an energy and mineral rights attorney and quietly separated the subsurface rights from the surface deed before the primary distributions was structured. Those rights are attached exclusively to Cecilia's parcel. My aunt made a sound I didn't have a word for. Archer's jaw tightened. How significant? Mr. Caldwell opened the second folder and removed a document with figures I could see from across the table, though I could not yet read them. He slid a copy toward me first, then placed one in front of Archer. A regional energy company approached your grandmother 14 months ago with a long-term extraction and royalty agreement. The projected royalty income over the initial 20-year contract period. He paused, not for drama, but simply because he was a precise man. Exceeds what the agricultural operation is projected to generate over the same period, based on current land valuations and crop lease rates. Archer picked up the document. I watched his eyes move across the page. I watched the color shift in his face. That can't be right, he said quietly. It is, Mr. Caldwell said. Furthermore, he turned to a second page in the folder. The 340 acres designated for agricultural use carry an outstanding equipment financing agreement, a deferred maintenance liability on the irrigation infrastructure, and a standing commercial lease dispute that has been in mediation for approximately 8 months. Archer stared at him. Your grandmother was aware of these obligations. She felt the operation remained viable and that you were well positioned to manage them. But she wanted the terms clearly understood. He looked back at the letter briefly, then continued. She wrote one final note at the bottom of the page. She asked me to read it last. He picked up the letter again. Cecilia never asked me what she would receive. Not once. She asked me how I was feeling. She asked me what I wanted for dinner. She asked me if I remembered the name of the song my mother used to sing, and then she found it on her telephone and played it for me while we sat on the porch. That is the kind of person she is. I want her to have the security she never asked for, because people who never ask are so rarely given anything, and that is the thing in this world I have always found most unfair. I was crying. I was not trying to hide it. I didn't have the capacity to care about being seen crying, because the words were so entirely her, the rhythm of them. The indignation in that last sentence, the way she had always spoken about fairness with a quiet fury that she rarely showed anyone outside our kitchen. The room was silent for a long moment after Mr. Caldwell set the letter down. Then my aunt said softly, to no one in particular, she knew exactly what she was doing. Archer had not moved. He was still holding the document. His jacket looked different somehow, like the room had changed around it. He set the papers down with a careful, deliberate movement, and I could see in his hands that he was working to keep his face composed. He said nothing. One of my cousins reached over and briefly touched my arm. That small gesture undid something in me that I had been holding together for months, maybe for years. I pressed my hand over my mouth and breathed through it. Mr. Caldwell gave us a few minutes before he continued with the procedural details, signing schedules, transfer timelines, contact information for the energy company's attorney. He spoke to me directly then, explaining the next steps, and I tried to absorb the information through the strange, thick haze of grief and relief. And something I didn't have a name for yet. As the meeting wrapped up and people began gathering their coats and bags, Archer remained seated. He was looking at the documents in front of him, with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he had already solved. I passed behind his chair on my way out. I didn't say anything to him. I had said nothing cruel when I had every reason to. I wasn't going to begin now. Outside, the Nashville air was cool and smelled like rain coming. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and called my mother, who had not been able to attend. When she picked up, I didn't know where to start. So I just said, "Grandma wrote us a letter." And then I couldn't say anything else for a while. Later, driving back toward Carthage, back toward the farmhouse that was now mine in every legal and paperwork sense of the word, though it had felt like mine in every other sense for a long time already, I thought about what my grandmother had said in that letter, about people who never ask rarely being given anything, about how unfair she had always found that. She had spent 84 years watching the world operate on the assumption that the loudest people deserved the most. She had watched men shake hands over land she tended. She had watched credit flow naturally toward whoever stood up straight and spoke first. She had watched it her whole life, and she had thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything. And then she had done something about it. I pulled into the gravel driveway as the first drops of rain began to hit the windshield. The farmhouse looked exactly the way it always had. The porch light was on because I had left it on that morning, which was something my grandmother always insisted on. She said it was bad luck to come home to a dark house. I sat in the car for a minute before going inside. I wasn't ready to go in yet. The house was full of her things, and I wasn't ready to be surrounded by all of it without a few more seconds of preparation. I thought about the last evening we had spent on that porch together, maybe 10 days before she died. She had been tired and a little short of breath, but she wanted to sit outside, and so we did. We watched the light change over the fields. She held her mug of decaf with both hands, the way she always did. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. After a while, she looked over at me and said, "I hope you know I see you." That was all. I hadn't known, until that evening in the attorney's office, exactly how clearly she had seen me. I hadn't known that she had been sitting on a piece of information for years, had made decisions and signed documents and thought carefully about my future, while I drove her to appointments and refilled her prescriptions and sat beside her on this porch without expecting anything in return. She had seen me the whole time. She had just waited until the right moment to say so. The rain came down harder. I finally got out of the car and walked up the porch steps, and when I pushed open the front door, the house smelled like cedar and old wood, and the particular scent that belongs only to the place where someone you love has lived for a very long time. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I turned on the kitchen light, sat down at the table where we had talked every evening for 6 years, and let myself feel all of it. The loss and the love and the strange, overwhelming gift of being truly known by someone before they leave.